Reasons that I think dystopian stuff is so bad for us is I think it almost always shows a really inaccurate picture of the way that humans respond in disaster. This isn't naivete or anything. This is actually coming from the field of disaster studies, which has existed since around the beginning of the Cold War era, where the United States government realized that in the event of a nuclear apocalypse, we need to understand how people will behave so that we can try and restore order and stuff. And the people that work in this field slowly realize that actually in the event of a disaster, humans do great. Obviously, there's death and carnage and mayhem and all sorts of terrible things, but by and large, reports of stuff like looting are almost always overblown. And when there is looting, it's normally people who are like, oh, I'm going to the grocery, which is closed, and I'm taking food, which isn't really looting. It's just people feeding themselves in the best way they know how. The writer Rebecca Solnit covered this in her amazing book, A Paradise Built in Hell, and she calls them disaster utopias. And it's basically evidence that humans, when they're confronted with a really bad situation like this, don't just wait for the people in charge to arrive. They start fixing things themselves immediately. So when we talk about disasters, we talk about first responders a lot. But the best first responders, disaster scientists know, are the people who are already on the scene when it happens. They're not necessarily distinguishable from the victims. Just to take the example that everyone talks about the most, 9/11. During 9/11, we've talked a lot about the firefighters and the policemen who ran into the burning towers, but an enormous number of the lives that were saved were by the people who were already in the towers. There are stories of people in wheelchairs being carried down in their wheelchairs by other people who are fleeing for their lives. They stopped to do this, even though it could have meant slowing them down to the point of their death. There is also the Manhattan boat lift, which no one ever talks about. It was a bigger rescue by sea than the Dunkirk rescue in World War II. 400,000 people were evacuated from the southern tip of Manhattan by boats from New Jersey, Staten Island, and Long Island. They didn't have any sort of centralized organizing. It was just people who owned boats in that area, got on the boats, drove towards the wreckage, and picked people off the southern tip of Manhattan and saved their lives. The only people it serves for us to think that after a disaster, it's all violence and chaos are the authorities who want to re-exert control, since a lot of mutual aid networks spring up automatically in these instances. A lot of the times, looting and violence and things like that are really, really overplayed in the media so that they can justify the authorities coming back in and re-exerting control. And often the violence is committed not by just regular people, but by the authorities themselves. Most dystopias like to tell us that when things fall apart, people can't be trusted. But actually, the people that can't be trusted are the people in power. We actually can trust each other a lot.